Stephen woke up on the morning of his 60th birthday before the alarm rang. There was no urgency, no schedule demanding his attention. Sitting at the edge of the bed, he stared at his reflection, tracing the deep lines that hadn't been there a decade earlier. What unsettled him wasn't the gray hair or the stiff joints. It was the quiet realization that time was no longer asking for his effort. It was simply observing what remained. For most of his life, Stephen believed progress was something that happened later. There was always a future version of himself who would have more courage, more patience, more clarity. In his 30s, he postponed decisions because he felt young. In his 40s, he delayed them because he felt responsible. By 50, delay had become a habit rather than a choice, and habits rarely announce their consequences until it's too late. Stephen grew up believing stability was the highest form of success. His father had worked the same job for 40 years, repeating the same routine with quiet pride. Stephen absorbed that lesson early. Don't disrupt what works. Don't risk what you already have. So when opportunities appeared that required uncertainty, he learned to step aside politely and wait for a safer moment that never arrived. There was a woman he once imagined building a life with. They met when he was 32, both convinced they had plenty of time. She wanted movement, change, decisions. Stephen wanted certainty before commitment. He told her not yet, so many times that eventually she stopped asking. By the time he realized silence was an answer, she had already chosen a life that didn't include waiting. Career followed a similar pattern. Stephen was reliable, steady, respected. Promotions came slowly but predictably. He told himself fulfillment would arrive after the next milestone. Each achievement felt smaller than expected, but he assumed satisfaction was cumulative. What he didn't realize was that ambition postponed too long turns into endurance, and endurance slowly replaces desire without asking permission. At 60, retirement paperwork sat neatly organized in a drawer. Friends congratulated him on making it. They spoke about freedom, rest, travel. Stephen smiled and nodded, but inside something felt unfinished. Not incomplete in a dramatic sense, but unresolved. Like a sentence that had been paused mid-thought and forgotten, leaving behind a meaning that never fully formed. The regret Stephen carried wasn't about failure. He had avoided failure with remarkable consistency. It was about a single decision he postponed for decades, convinced he could return to it later. The problem wasn't that he chose incorrectly. The problem was that he never chose at all. And time, unlike people, doesn't offer reminders when patience expires. He tried revisiting the idea in his early 60s, testing whether it could still be revived. But circumstances had shifted. People had moved on. Energy had changed. What once required courage now required explanations. Stephen learned then that some choices are bound to a specific season of life. When that season passes, the choice doesn't wait behind. It disappears quietly. Regret didn't arrive as a sudden collapse. It settled in slowly, appearing in ordinary moments. In the grocery store, watching couples debate trivial purchases. In the evenings, when silence filled the rooms he had worked so hard to maintain. These moments weren't painful on their own. They were reminders. And reminders accumulate when ignored long enough. Stephen began to understand that time doesn't punish hesitation immediately. It rewards it at first, offering comfort and safety. Only later does it present the invoice. By then, the cost is no longer negotiable. The regret he couldn't fix wasn't dramatic enough to warn him early, and that's what made it permanent. When people asked Stephen what he would change if he could go back, he gave polite answers. Work less, worry less, enjoy life more. The truth was harder to explain. He wouldn't change what he did. He would change when he stopped waiting. Because waiting felt harmless until it quietly became his defining trait. At 60, Stephen wasn't unhappy. That distinction mattered. His life was functional, calm, predictable. But it lacked the weight of having chosen something fully. He realized too late that meaning doesn't come from avoiding mistakes. It comes from accepting the risk of making one. and that realization arrived after the opportunity to practice it had passed. Stephen's story doesn't end in tragedy, it ends in clarity. But clarity without the ability to act carries its own kind of grief. The regret he couldn't fix wasn't loud or dramatic. It was silent, persistent, and final. And that made it heavier than any failure he had successfully avoided his entire life. Friends spoke about reinvention, new hobbies, late-life passions, second chances. Stephen listened politely, but felt a subtle disconnect. Reinvention assumes momentum. It requires energy built from earlier risks. Stephen had spent most of his life conserving energy, not investing it. What he had saved was stability. What he lacked was motion, and motion doesn't begin easily when habits are already hardened. The regret he carried didn't haunt him loudly. It didn't interrupt his sleep or force dramatic reflection. Instead, it appeared during pauses. While washing dishes, while waiting at traffic lights, while staring at unfinished books he no longer felt compelled to read. It was the quiet awareness that something essential had been deferred until it no longer recognized him. Stephen often wondered when the regret began forming. There was no single moment, no clear mistake. It was constructed slowly through reasonable choices that made sense in isolation. Each delay felt justified. Each pause felt temporary. Only in retrospect did he see how those pauses connected, forming a pattern that eventually became his identity. He remembered being younger and believing time expanded to accommodate intention. That belief shaped his patience. He assumed desire was permanent, waiting patiently for him to return when circumstances improved. What he failed to understand was that desire ages too. It weakens when ignored and eventually stops signaling altogether. Attempts to recreate what he once postponed felt artificial. Conversations lacked urgency. Opportunities felt symbolic rather than real. The emotional cost of starting late wasn't failure. It was detachment. Stephen could still act, technically. But action without emotional momentum felt hollow, like rehearsing a life rather than living one. At 65, Stephen attended a reunion he almost skipped. Familiar faces carried unfamiliar expressions. Stories were told, laughter shared. But beneath the surface, he noticed how people spoke about decisive moments, risks taken, choices made. Even failures were described with ownership. Stephen listened carefully, realizing most people didn't regret their mistakes. They regretted their hesitation. Driving home that night, he understood something unsettling. His regret wasn't tied to a specific outcome. It was tied to the absence of commitment. He had never fully chosen a direction, always keeping alternatives open. That openness once felt wise. Now it felt empty. Possibility, unclaimed, had quietly expired. Stephen began journaling, not to find answers, but to document the shape of his thoughts. Patterns emerged quickly. Every page referenced waiting, timing, readiness, conditions. He realized how often he framed life as something that would begin once variables aligned. The tragedy wasn't misalignment. It was assuming alignment was required at all. He noticed how younger people spoke differently. They talked about fear openly, about uncertainty, about acting despite doubt. Stephen had believed fear was something to eliminate before moving forward. He now understood fear was the entry fee. Avoiding it hadn't made him safer. It had made him static. The regret hardened into clarity. Stephen wasn't angry with himself. He wasn't ashamed. He was disappointed in a quiet, factual way. Like discovering a room in a house had never been used and never would be. There was no drama in that realization, just permanence. As years passed, Stephen became more comfortable naming his regret internally, not publicly, not dramatically. He simply acknowledged it. This acknowledgement didn't heal anything, but it prevented confusion. He stopped pretending the feeling would dissolve on its own. Acceptance replaced hope, and hope, he realized, had been misplaced all along. Stephen understood then that time doesn't steal opportunities. It waits patiently while people do. It allows delay to feel harmless until the cost is no longer reversible. His regret couldn't be fixed because it wasn't broken. It had matured naturally from years of careful avoidance. He stopped offering advice to younger people. Advice felt insufficient. Instead, he listened. He noticed how often they spoke about waiting for confidence, for clarity, for permission. He recognized the language immediately. It was his own, decades earlier. He wanted to interrupt, but new words rarely override experience. In quieter moments, Stephen reflected on the irony of his life. He had avoided risk to preserve stability. Yet stability without direction had slowly eroded meaning. What remained was comfort, stripped of excitement, and peace without fulfillment. It wasn't suffering. It was something harder to justify. The regret he couldn't fix wasn't about love alone, or career, or identity. It was about agency, about surrendering the responsibility of choosing his life moment by moment. He had outsourced that responsibility to time, assuming it would eventually decide for him. At 70, Stephen no longer tried to reframe his past positively. He didn't romanticize his patience. He respected it for what it had been, a strategy that worked until it didn't. This honesty brought a strange calm. There was relief in naming the cost accurately. He became more present in small ways. Walks lasted longer. Conversations deepened slightly. But presence couldn't retroactively create meaning where intention had been absent. Stephen learned that awareness is powerful, but it doesn't reverse entropy. Some lessons arrive intact but unusable. People describe Stephen as thoughtful, reflective, wise. He accepted the descriptions quietly, aware of their limitations. Wisdom without application felt incomplete. Insight without consequence felt decorative. He carried his regret not as a warning, but as evidence. In the final years, Stephen stopped asking what he would do differently. The question implied an alternate timeline that no longer existed. Instead, he asked what his story revealed. The answer was simple and unflattering. Waiting feels safe until it becomes permanent. Stephen turned 60 with one regret he couldn't fix, not because he lacked time, but because he misunderstood how time works. It doesn't demand decisions, it records them, and the absence of a decision is still a choice, one that quietly shapes everything that follows.